Well, all biennales, in a way, occupy a space which is somewhere between, isn't it? And Manifesta was sometimes a space between ambitions of founding a museum of contemporary art, as in Luxembourg, for instance, or an ambition of moving somewhere towards a more kind of Western-orientated culture, as in the case of Ljubljana, where there was a real attempt to kind of integrate with Western traditions of philosophy and so on. So I think the in-betweenness of Manifesta was quite suited to its nomadic constitution as well. It had an east-west emphasis at first, but we quite soon extended that to be north-south, whether we maybe a bit of south-south, as in the case of Murcia last year. But obviously there are practical realities that intervene, and the organisation of Manifesta is always sandwiched somewhere between the curatorial end and the artists and so on, and the host city or the host country, the funders and so on. So in reality, all the editions have taken place pretty much in the West. Ljubljana was about as far east as it's gone. On the other hand, it best fulfilled its ambition of platforming artists from Eastern Europe in the early editions, perhaps. And I remember we nearly went to Hungary, you remember, to Budapest. And I remember actually one of our colleagues in Budapest saying, well, yes, we'd love to have it here. It didn't work out that way for various reasons, but actually for artists from the East it's much more interesting to be seen in Frankfurt, and they can also travel much more cheaply, and the audiences can travel much more cheaply. So it's a complicated equation. So it didn't work out in quite the same way, but I think it has become more and more expansive in the sense of, and inclusive in the sense of what Europe might be.
In which way was the origin of Manifesta the conclusion of the humanist ideal in Europe at the end of the last century?
Well, it's interesting you should talk about the humanist ideal, because there is still a series of Council of Europe exhibitions which bring together work from a very wide range of European countries, which began in the mid-1950s, and it began with Renaissance Europe, which is quite a humanist Europe. And that series has tried to pull together certain common themes, and although Manifesta is 1,000 miles from those historical exhibitions of the 50s, it shares some of the ambition, I think, of defining what a European cultural identity may be. It arrives at a very different and very complex conclusion, perhaps, but we can talk about that too.
How did Manifesta differentiate itself towards the other biennials?
First of all, to take the established ones, Venice and Documenta, it's difficult to talk about them in general terms, obviously, because they've evolved like everything else. But in the old days, they used to set the pattern. Nowadays, they tend to follow the pattern. If you look at the 2003, I think it was, Venice Biennale, the pattern there was set quite clearly, it seems to me, by the chief curator, and it was modelled on an idea of Manifesta, actually. Which
Francesco Bonami.
Yeah, Francesco Bonami, which was to invite 8 or 9 curators to do their own thing, in a sense, but as a collective enterprise. The intention, one of the intentions, which we haven't mentioned of a Manifesta when it was started, was to give a voice to young artists who are outside the market, and I think it's very important to stress that it was a function, and this is where the Dutch origins come in, it was a function that had been met reasonably well by the Biennale de Paris, and as you remember, longer than I do, the Bureau of Fine Arts in the Netherlands thought that there was a real need to replace that with something, and the Aperto in Venice was not a replacement for that. It was a way of bringing young artists to the attention of a wide public, and I'm thinking of people like Schnabel and Kapoor and so on, if you like. But these were artists who had galleries who were promoting them heavily in the West. There was absolutely no space for artists who hadn't got a gallery. And the reason why Aperto was full of very good and promising young artists was because the commercial galleries behind them would pay for their presence in Venice. It was fairly basic. Venice was not going to be able to, or not wanting to, pay for a lot of young artists to pay for their work to be produced there. and so on. They would look to the galleries they would choose the artists, but the galleries would then, of course, meet
and this
costs.
is maybe an aspect which, and we certainly have to mention Gijs van Tuyl, who was like the really original conceptualizer of what Manifesta in the end is supposed to be, and based on his involvement in the Biennale de la Jeunesse, of which the last edition was hosted in Paris in 1983, in which he really thought a future biennial or a future platform for European artists should be a research platform.
Yes.
Can you defend the Eurocentric model of Manifesta at the end of the 20th century?
And we must defend it, because I think that in a sense, things like biennales, things like museums actually even are a product of the European Enlightenment, and it's a European idea, and European ideas have not always been good, I have to say. Colonialism is an aspect of the European reality, and so too, though, as a positive aspect, is the presence in our midst of a very high proportion of people from the former colonies. Europe is a sort of microcosm of the world as one would wish it to be in some ways, provided it's not viewed as a fortress, but as an open and porous vessel. I mean, fewer than something like 1 in 4 or even 1 in 3 Londoners today were born not only outside Britain but outside Europe. And this is the reality of the European cities, many of the great European cities. And European culture, the culture of the Renaissance, we were talking about humanism and so on, was founded on this interaction between, yes, Christianity, but also the other great monotheist beliefs, Judaism and Islam. And so I think the essence of being European is to be aware of the kind of wide openness of European society and potential. The other side of that, flip side, is of course the question of frontiers. We all live within frontiers, which are physical, political, this, that and the other. Isn't that the nature of the human kind and humankind? And not to be aware of frontiers is to be unaware of oneself.
Manifesta is accused often as being acting as a career machine for young curators. How influential is the experimental and often problematic role of Manifesta's curatorial methodology? As you know that in the beginning, Manifesta's role was to change from the single model of the single curator to the collective curatorship. Now maybe, and sometimes like in Manifesta 3, collective curatorship even as a starting point. How do you look back at this? Because as you know, there was a conflictious model to be presented to always create consensus in between the individual members of the collectives.
But the model has certainly changed every time. It's been rethought every time, and it's changed quite noticeably from one time to the next, actually. But it is one of the features that I think work pretty well with Manifesta, actually. And I think because I think it's enabled it to stay fresh and to express and to contain conflict as well as to manifest it. But the tradition, we began with the idea that there should be sort of tutelage. There was a board member, if you remember, for the first time, who actually, of an older generation, who stepped down from the board to look after 4 other young curators, and she very quickly, Caterina Nero, very quickly decided that they should work on the basis of absolute equality. Yeah. And that, I think, set the pace for the first few editions, and then we thought, well, there's no need to have any kind of tutelage. There's a bright new generation coming through, and Manifesta gave the first opportunity or first major international opportunity to quite a number of these young curators who are now international names, and they in turn, of course, have carried the seeds, the germ of the idea of Manifesta to the many biennales they've been involved with subsequently.
How would you foresee the near future? Europe is changing immensely. Yeah. We're in the midst of a European financial monetary crisis. We're in the midst of a governance crisis in Europe. Some countries even like to step down. Manifesta is not a European Union. But how would you see our future?
To stay inventive, I suppose. Maybe I could see a greater involvement of artists, actually, because I think the Manifesta Decade, the title of that famous publication, was really the decade of the curator, and Manifesta really highlighted many of the kind of issues about curating, and I think played an immensely important role there. But I think we moved on from there, and I think that the sort of barriers between the curator and the artist have become much more fluid and flexible. And I think the idea of collective curating also is maybe something that we've gone through.
Or artists as curators.
And yes, and I could see that as one possible way ahead. For myself, I think the really important thing is to keep a kind of core concept of what the Biennale should be. It's rather and then to be responsive to changing realities,
circumstances.
Yeah, I mean it's very
time and location and politics.
Exactly, it's like commissioning an architect. I mean, what you take the greatest care about the architect you commission, and of course, and about the brief that you offer. But then you have to leave the artist, the architect, find the solutions. And I think it's the danger, the risk is always trying to determine too closely what happens afterwards. You have to kind of set the frame, and then you have to let things work themselves out. But to do that, then you have to be in touch with, obviously, with not just the art world. I mean, what's going on.
Much larger, much complexer.
Larger. It's about life in the end,
Yeah,
and it's about society, and it's about the changing nature of society.